All right. So our session today will be on principles with Sheheyar Fazal. So Sheheyar has a stacked debate CV. Sheheyar is part of the Princeton debate panel. He's on the board, and in WDC 2024, Sheheyar was broke 22nd, reached octo finals. Additionally, Sheheyar has a amazing track record in the WSDC circuit as well. Sheheyar has been the second highest speaker in the ESR category, ninth open, broken to quarterfinals, done a lot of cool stuff. Bunch of other tournaments as well, like participated at HWS, UCLA IV, all that good stuff. So Sharia's session today will be on principles, so how you apply them in debates, utility, or what you need to be thinking of, potential arguments, etc. So the session will have like two focuses. Like one will maybe be like an intro level that Sharia will explain, and then we'll go deeper. So there'll be a wide range of applicability of like how you can use this content. Uh, as I mentioned before, this session will be much, much better if you could turn cameras on, engage with the speaker, because the point of this series is to get down international speakers in a way that you can access them. And it's not just you watching like a lecture that's pre-recorded on YouTube, that you can actively interact and like take something back for yourself and for your schools. So yeah, thank you so much for coming. If you have friends who want to show up, let them know as well. But yeah, let's have a good session, guys.
Awesome. Thank you, Janel. Before I do that, can I just confirm exactly how much time I have so I know it, so I just kind of keep track.
So the session was like framed to be, I think, 1.5 hours, but depending on how it goes, your time, yeah,
Okay.
we can just, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, okay. We won't need an hour and a half. It's all right. But just one thing, to everybody else in the audience, just feel free to unmute yourself at any point if you have any questions. I would appreciate it if this is as interactive as possible. You guys will take out the most from it, and it'll be a good session. All right. So, to start off, I think the first thing I want to just talk about is what do I mean by principled arguments? Because there are two possible ways of looking at it. One is a very debate-centric way, and one is just like a very general way of looking at it. So a principled argument in the context of a debate, or generally when we say, I made a principled argument in a debate context, what it generally means is that you made an argument to explain why something is good or why something should happen, um, not because it will lead to good consequences or not because it will lead to X, Y, or Z, but because what that thing is just worth doing in of itself. So basically, that act on its own is a reason for why you should do something. That's basically what we generally mean when we say principled in a debate context, and I'll explain this in more detail. But just as a rule of thumb, what is not a principled argument is an argument that would be something along the lines of, we should pass this policy because it will lead to certain outcomes, and those outcomes are worth it. That would be a consequential argument. And as the name indicates, it's an argument that is entirely dependent, or an argument that relies on you demonstrating that certain consequences will come about, and then proving why those consequences are good. So just so you know, like in a debate context, like what do we mean when we say principled arguments? That's what we generally mean. I tend to call principled arguments normative claims, because I think that's like the better term. The reason for that is because in any debate, irrespective of whatever argument you run, you are fundamentally proving that this is something that is like good, that this is something that is fair. There are generally two ways of approaching this. One way of approaching this argument, or one way of trying to prove this, is by demonstrating that you achieve certain outcomes. That is a consequentialist claim. The other way of doing this is by saying that this act on its own, this act in of itself, is principally or normatively legitimate, which is why we should do it. So that's what a principled argument is, or a normative argument is. The question then is, why do we make them, and like why are they worth making? Um, Generally, people have different preferences. Certain debaters tend to prefer consequentialist arguments more. Some debaters don't. That doesn't really matter. What matters is that you have a range of tools when it comes to debate, and you can make a series of arguments. You can make different types of arguments. It's upon you whether you think that this is a good argument to make in a particular debate or not to make in a particular debate. But I can tell you why making principled arguments is good if they are made properly. That's like the most important thing. If a principled argument is made properly, it can be incredibly powerful. So just to demonstrate to you how powerful it could be, and we could maybe even like have a little game. I'm gonna type a motion in the chat. I want everybody to have a look at this motion, and within like take 3 minutes and just think of one big argument that you would make and why you think that argument is so important. So I'll just put the motion in the chat and just have a look at it. Take 3 minutes and think of just one argument that you think you would make, and I'll just talk about that in a bit. I'm just gonna put the motion in the chat. So this house believes that the state should retain ownership of the works of deceased artists as opposed to, perhaps the artist's family. I just want everybody to take like 3 minutes, have a look at this motion, and tell me like, one big argument that you would make. If anybody has any questions with respect to the motion, if you don't understand anything, you can also like ask me that as well. But like, let's take 3 minutes.
Excuse me, is this proper of
Oh, proposition. Oh, thank you. That's a good question. Proposition. You're saying an argument in favor of this motion. Take like 2-3 minutes and we'll talk about this. All right, one more minute. Awesome. Okay. Any thoughts from anyone, like at all, of what is like a potential argument? If you feel uncomfortable, perhaps saying something in the mic, you could even put it in the chat. That's also fine. You could do that. But just like, like a one-liner about like what you think is the most like, important argument or the best argument that you think could be made with respect to this motion. Any volunteers? Anyone?
excuse me, Anya? Yeah.
Sorry. Hmm?
Yeah, I have one where this will help art be more easily put into the public domain rather than taking more than 2, 3, 4, 5 decades for it to reach the public domain. That like it is currently.
Okay. Sounds good. Awesome. Anybody else? That's perfectly good as well. That's a good argument. Anybody else? Any other thoughts? Okay,
The
I think we can.
government,
Sorry, yes.
the government can easily ensure the safety of the work of art itself.
The government can ensure safety. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. Any other thoughts? That's a good argument. Any other thoughts?
We will start calling on people maybe later on in the workshop, or like I could just stay out random names. So be prepared. And it's a lot easier maybe if you do that. Like speak up of your own volition, guys, right?
Okay, I hope you don't have to do that. But anyhow, okay, we can work with this. This is good. So we have two arguments. One person said that okay, we have three arguments now. This encourages more artists. Okay, awesome. So we have three arguments right now. One argument is about art and its accessibility. One argument is about something related to how the state can make art safer. And we have a third argument about how it encourages new artists. And we have we have another argument that somebody sent to me privately about how the state has a right to do this, but we'll get to that in a bit. So we have these three arguments: accessibility, safety, and encouraging new artists. These are all perfectly sound arguments. These are good ideas, but there are a couple of, I would say, shortcomings of these arguments, even if they were, like made properly and constructed really well. One issue with all of these arguments is that they're a bit uncertain, right? It's not necessarily true. And by necessarily, I mean like it's not guaranteed. It never really is in most policy debates, or even in debates where you do an action, that this particular thing will happen. So what I mean to say by that is that if I were to take the argument that someone said about encouraging new artists, suppose you were to make this argument. Suppose this argument is made well. And when I say it's made well, what I mean is all the fundamental questions or the fundamental premises for this argument, they've all been answered. But the problem is, no matter how many reasons you give, there will always be, some reason or some world out there where perhaps this might not happen, no matter how many good reasons you give, right? That's one shortcoming of all these arguments. The other shortcoming of all these arguments is that while they're all, good arguments, there's one really important question they haven't answered, which is, can the state even do this? Should the state even do this? I mean, think about it. Can the state and should the state take away the hard-earned work of people who have labored their entire lives to make something and just simply take it away? Should the state do it? Can the state do it? Right? That's a question worth asking, right? So what I'm trying to say is like all the arguments that I got prior to this are all correct ideas. They only lack in one way, and that is essentially they don't ask this really important question. Sorry, if anybody is sending me messages in the chat, I will try to answer them as I go along. But if I don't, just like remind me later on, right? So crucially, then the shortcoming of all these arguments is they don't answer one really important question, which is the legitimacy behind the action. So, for example, if I were to give you, let's say, another debate motion about vaccine mandates, okay? We've all seen and observed how vaccine mandates were prevalent around during the COVID-19 pandemic. And oftentimes, if you were to see the argument that was made to propose like, vaccine mandates for everybody, the argument wasn't that if we do this, that, we'll stop the spread of the disease. That was like one argument. But a core like argument that was given in terms of state responsibility was that the state should do this because the state has a responsibility to all of its citizens and its safety. And this is the best way to achieve that or to maximize that, right? So that was a reason for why it was legitimate for the state to have this. So now that we have like this idea and this intuition, what I want you to gather from this is that in a debate, you can always make a consequentialist claim which is a claim saying that certain outcomes are good, which is why the motion should be passed or not passed. And the other set of arguments is that some things are just, good arguments, or some arguments are good arguments because you can prove something innate about them. Something good is
I think we might be experiencing slight technical difficulty. Give me 2 minutes. I'll contact the speaker and see if we can get them back online. Thank you.
Oops. All right. Sorry about that. Sorry about that. I think I cut out because of my internet. Yeah. All right. Sorry about that. Anyhow, what I was saying essentially, what I was trying to demonstrate through the example, with this art motion was the idea of intuition, which is that principled arguments tend to often be really good arguments because they often pander to human intuitions, and they often pander to human intuition really well. If you take the example of the art motion that we had, all the ideas that you guys gave me about encouraging young artists, about accessibility, all those are good arguments, no doubt about them. You could make them, you could potentially win a debate on them. But all of them don't answer some really underlying questions about the debate motion, which are really intuitive if you just think about it for 5 minutes. And they try to answer those questions. So that's the benefit, and that's the beauty of making principled arguments, is that they often invoke those parts for intuition, which are really basic. And most judges will often, buy it if principled arguments are made properly, right? So now I'm going to dive a little bit more into the mechanics of principled arguments, how we make them, what are important concepts. And right now, all I did was just, try to give you guys just the basic layout of what principled arguments are. But before I go forward, are there any questions anybody would like to ask? Any questions at all?
I was wondering if you could summarize all that you have said so far.
Sorry?
If you could summarize all you have said so far about principal arguments, just
Yeah.
I
So
want.
so the takeaway that you should have from the discussion so far is this. Principled arguments are arguments that are devoid of consequences. So when you make a principled argument, you're not saying that certain consequences will happen, which is why you should do this. You're often talking about something more intrinsic, something more underlying, and in other words, something more intangible. Oftentimes, these arguments pander to our human intuition in ways that other arguments don't, which is why they are worth making. And the last thing is, if they are made properly, which we're going to discuss now, they're a really powerful tool. I think those are the important things that you should take away. Any other questions? Okay, brilliant. So we're gonna now discuss how to make principled arguments. Before we do that, and before I sort of give you guys a template for how I think of principled arguments, and then we'll do a couple of examples, I want to cover three topics or three sort of areas. Specifically, I want to talk about ownership arguments. I want to talk about arguments related to harms and sort of liberalism. And the third thing I want to talk about is, sorry, I have it right here, is arguments about responsibility. You guys will very soon realize why I'm talking about these things. So if this seems a bit abstract right now, don't worry. The reason I want to talk about these three sort of areas is because oftentimes you guys will notice that in principled arguments, oftentimes, people will say, what is your principle? Like, what is your principle? And oftentimes somebody will say, oh, I made a utilitarian argument, or I made a liberal argument, or I made this. Generally speaking, that's a sort of way of how people sometimes approach principled arguments. Not everybody does. But the point is, in principled arguments, certain ideas are rehashed all the time. And so when I was sort of preparing for this presentation, I thought of, like, within this time frame, if there are three important topic areas for principled arguments that often come up again and again, there are these three things. So let's talk about them one by one. Let's first talk about ownership, right? And by ownership, what I basically mean is, like, why is it that I have the right to own this cup, right? Like, why do I own this? Why is it that if Janil were to take this from me, I could say that he stole it from me? Does anybody have any thoughts? Like, where does this ownership come from? Who gave it to me? Why do I have it? So somebody says consent. That could be one. That could be one. But the problem with consent is that I'm to consent to this implies that I had ownership before I gave it to Janil. So why did I have ownership over it is the question. So consent only applies when I give it to him. I'm talking about before I even give it to him. Why do I own it? Why do I have access to this good? Someone says that I purchased it. Okay, still getting there. Any other thoughts? So somebody said autonomy, and I think that's an interesting idea. Yeah, okay. Some people say that it's merit. Okay, awesome. Okay, so we have a range of answers. So all of these are. Sorry, did somebody? Sorry, I could not understand what that was. Okay, I think that was, yeah. Anyhow, okay, these are good answers, I think, generally speaking. But I think the underlying question still sort of remains, right? Like why can I claim that, something like this phone is mine, and if somebody takes it from me, I can take them to court, I can sue them. The state could even punish that person for taking what I had. So the question really is, like, where does ownership come from? Lucky for us, there was a guy called John Locke several hundred years ago, who made this argument. And I think if you guys are curious, you can go up and look this up yourself. By the way, for principled arguments, the best resource is Stanford Encyclopedia for Philosophy. If you ever need to learn anything about any philosophical or like abstract thing, just go there, and I promise you it will solve everything. So anyhow, John Locke made the argument for where ownership basically stems from, right? Which is that he made the argument that an individual owns their body, right? You own yourself, you own your autonomy. And so if you use yourself, let's say your labor, to create something, right? That something is an extension of you, is an extension of yourself, because you have mixed your labor with your autonomy and with yourself. Because that is something that is an extension of you, someone else taking away that something from you, i.e. Janil taking away my phone from me, is the equivalent of theft, right? And similarly, you can make the arguments for later on how, if you make something, you can sell it as well. You can dictate the price of how much you want to put it at, blah, 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 right? But the point is, that is a core argument, and perhaps the most philosophically sound argument you can make for why someone has a claim of ownership over something. Does this make sense? Does everybody follow? Okay.
Someone else?
Yeah. That's a very good answer. In fact, that is precisely what it is. The idea being that your labor is basically a set of actions that you carry out, but you carrying those actions out depends on a range of factors that you didn't do anything about. So, for instance, if you are more physically fit than other individuals at certain things, for example, if you're 6'5", you have a comparative advantage in playing basketball, for instance, right? The point is that your labor is often arbitrary. That's often a common word that people will use in debates. It's also just a nice word. But it's an arbitrary thing, right? And it is not the case that you 100% own your labor. And so, like, this is one way of you like weakening that argument. The point over here is not to show to you, by the way, that one argument is better than the other argument. They are both good arguments. The point is, they are both principled arguments. And as you can see, what we're discussing right now is purely on the legitimacy of this. Yes, I see somebody's hand raised. Sure. Okay, I suppose they weren't raising a hand. Anyhow, so yeah, that's like on ownership, right? And if you're wondering, like, why these arguments are so important and why I explain them, these arguments will show up in debates all the time. Like the debate the debate motion I gave about the artists. If you were, the opposition, you could very easily just make the argument that the person or the artist, even if they're dead, they made this art, and the state taking it away is not legitimate or right because it fundamentally violates all the hard work they put in, and they deserve to have access to the fruits of their labor. And if they cannot have that, then their next of kin, their spouse, or their family, and so on and so forth should. And then at proposition, you could have, an entirely other set of arguments about how the state can do this because the state, for instance, gave these artists the platform to make their art through, perhaps tax subsidies or special arts programs or art scholarships, and so on and so forth, right? The point is, these arguments can be used in a range of debates. This was just one example. So this was about ownership. Are there any questions? Yes, I see someone's hand still raised. I don't know if they want to ask a question. Any other questions? Okay, awesome. So that's on ownership. I think the second thing then is about responsibility. Again, like ownership arguments, you will see responsibility arguments being thrown around in debates all the time. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a motion in the chat, and I'm going to sort of like repeat the same sort of like actually no, I'll do that later. Let's take a simple I think intuition example. This is a very common example in philosophy. You'll often also see it on the Stanford Encyclopedia for Philosophy as well, which is it's called the drowning child analogy, which is that suppose that one day you're walking back from work or from school or wherever, and you're walking past a pond and you see a child. You don't know who the child is, and this child is drowning. And the analogy essentially is that you can choose to do one of two things. This is also very similar to the trolley problem, if any of you have ever heard of that. But basically, you could do one of two things. You could either save the child, or you could, not save the child and just walk past. In the instance that you simply walk past, how many of you think that what this person has done should be punishable? Those of you who think that could just like, raise your hands or just like text in the chat. I don't know, whatever you feel comfortable with. Okay. And okay, Awesome. So you guys would say that this person should be punished for not doing this. Okay. How many of you think what this person has done is like really, really bad, but it's still not like legally punishable? Like that's maybe pushing it. How many of you think that? Okay. And how many of you think that, oh no, this person just like, this person has straight up hurt someone and they should be, thrown into jail? Okay, awesome. So this is a classic analogy, and there's no like right answer to this, to this question. I can tell you though, what the two set of arguments are. For those of you who said that this is punishable and this should be punished, and what this person has done should be legally punished, these are individuals who would posit that capacity is often a good reason for why someone should be responsible for something. Basically saying that if you, as an individual, walk past this pond and you saw this individual who was in a state of suffering, was dying, and you chose not to help them, you yourself have aided and abetted in their suffering because you had the means to prevent it without causing significant harm to yourself, yet you chose not to, which is why you are a bad person. So that's like one argument, which uses capacity as your reason for why you have responsibility. But somebody who perhaps doesn't, agree with this viewpoint, who says that, no, you're not like, like this makes no sense. They would say that, no, this person does not have the responsibility of saving this child. The reason for that is because, first of all, if any act means that it could come at the cost of their own well-being, that is a good reason on its own. So that's number one. You can't guarantee their safety. That's like one reason. The second reason for why, this is not, they shouldn't be punished is because responsibility does not stem from capacity, it stems from causality. What that basically means is that if you caused someone's suffering, i.e., if you, for instance, hurt someone, if you defamed someone, and the court tells you to pay them back in settlement money, that's the court telling you to compensate them for something you did to them in terms of damages. So that set of people would basically posit that responsibility doesn't stem from capacity, it stems from causality, and that's something we should care about, right? But there's a third place, by the way, as well, where responsibility can come from. Can anybody randomly guess? So one place is capacity, one is, causality, if you did something or didn't do something. There's another place where responsibility can also stem from. Can anybody guess? Think about the government. Like the government, oftentimes, how like people will say that, oh, the government was supposed to do this, but they didn't do this. It's a bad government, right? People will often say this. The reason people say this is not because the government has capacity. Some governments have more capacity, some governments have lesser capacity. Sometimes governments have like literally no capacity to do something, but yet people will still say that you're supposed to do this. It's because sometimes, and this is, by the way, the real world, and I think somebody also just said this, authority, which is that oftentimes we give responsibility to certain actors willingly. So for instance, when economic crises happen, think about it intuitively. When a recession happens, or when some really economic, bust happens, or a recession or a depression, something of the sort happens, you won't see people going around and saying that, XYZ billionaire should be used to, fix this depression or recession. Oftentimes people will direct their blame to governments. People will often also have a lot of grievances towards the elite in society, but they will often always say, you as the government have failed. It was your job to help us because we told you, because we gave you that right, because we put you in that position. So it's not necessarily important that, capacity and causality are the only places where responsibility comes from. Responsibility can come through consent as well, right? So these are three places where responsibility can potentially come from. Again, the point of saying all of this to all of you is not to show you that, like, the causality stuff is better than the capacity stuff, and the capacity stuff is better than the authority stuff or anything of the sort. By no means am I trying to do that. All I'm trying to show to you is that there are a range of different ways for you to make these arguments, and you will come across these debates that use these arguments very, very often. All right. Any questions before we move on to the third and the last, like, sort of concept that we're going to go over? Any questions? No? All right, awesome. All right then. The last thing we're going to talk about then is the harm principle. Just out of curiosity, does anybody know what the harm principle is? Any guesses? If anybody has an idea. Completely fine if you don't, by the way. I was just doing this for fun. So let me ask you guys this. If I ask you guys, like, let me think. Sorry, give me 1 second. All right. So let me ask you guys a very simple question. This is a question that is often asked in every country across the world, but it's like, when can you, if you can, when can you censor some things as the government? Or can you even do that at all? Open question, no right answer. What do you guys think? How many of you are amongst the group of people who would say that no censorship, like you should just like never, ever, ever censor anything at all? It doesn't matter. You could believe that, it would be perfectly fine. Libertarians tend to go about that view. How many of you are of the view that some things should be censored or blocked by the government? Just that, like, some things should be, some things. Okay, fair enough. Awesome. Okay, so most people agree with you guys, and most democracies across the world also agree with you guys, which is that on occasion, sometimes we need to censor people, and we need to stop things from happening. My question to you guys then is what are those cases where we censor things? From the top of your head, like, what are the sort of instances where we do this? And this is an open question, anybody can answer.
At the point where that information directly harms the well-being of the citizens of a country.
Okay. How much does it need to affect their well-being? Like, is there a bar for that?
I suppose at the point at which there's going to be a large where it causes conflict, which would then lead to harm, something like riots.
Okay. So you're saying that the state can censor certain things to preemptively ensure bad things don't happen. Okay, that's a fair argument. Some people are texting and they're saying that when your actions hurt another person, hate speech. Okay, good example. So yeah, you guys are in the right domain. You're in the right domain. But let me explain it in more detail. And again, these are not my ideas. These were written by people very, very long ago. So if you're interested in who I'm about to talk about now, his name was John Stuart Mill. He wrote a paper called On Liberty, and it's a fascinating piece of reading. If you can, again, go to Stanford Encyclopedia, which I think John will put down in the chat. You can go there and have a look at what he wrote, and you'll see what it basically was. And in it, basically, what he argues, and again, this is one side of it. We're going to challenge this side as well. But basically what he argues is that the bar for censoring speech and preventing someone from saying something is a very high bar. And it is something that we should do as a last resort. Why does he say this? The reason he says this is because your speech and what you say can often is unpalatable and is often not particularly nice towards people. So it can be offensive is the idea. That is nonetheless not a reason for why you should why we should not allow certain people from saying something or for us to ban this speech act, the reason we shouldn't do that is because it is a fundamental violation of the autonomy of that individual to be able to express their thoughts openly. And as long as those thoughts are not causing a significant, i.e., a harm that is really, really like damaging to them. And secondly, the harm is not unavoidable, which is to say, you're subjecting somebody to harm in such a way that they cannot categorically avoid that harm. Then in those two cases, what you basically have is a good reason for why you should not censor something. If you, however, do cause significant and unavoidable harm to someone, then according to John Stuart Mill, it is perfectly okay for you to censor them or to ban that speech act. But what do you guys think is the issue with this so-called harm principle, as I've just demonstrated it to you? What is a weakness in this argument that he's made? And if not even a weakness, what is an observation that you can just make very quickly about this sort of criteria or this argument? Yeah, so somebody just, sorry, yes?
It only takes effect in extreme situations and cases.
Sorry, could you repeat that?
It only takes effect in extreme cases and or scenarios.
Sure. So that's one interpretation of it, but I think for, and most people are also typing this, and they're sending it to me as well, which is that basically harms can be subjective. It is really, really hard to answer what is significant harm. Like, what is significant harm? I don't even know the answer to that question. Like, there are ways to theorize it. There are ways to answer this. But the point of me bringing this up was to basically show this, that oftentimes in debates regarding censorship, oftentimes in debates, even generally surrounding principled arguments, you will almost always need to sometimes come up with a criteria. So John Stuart Mill came up with a criteria. He said significant and unavoidable. If the harms are like this, then we can ban it. That's all he did. That's all he gave us. So in debates, you're going to often have to take the specific thing that you're arguing about, and you're supposed to fit that into this framework. So for instance, suppose you have a debate motion about, I don't know, bringing Donald Trump back to Twitter, for instance. Suppose this motion was set like a year ago. If you had that debate motion, you will inevitably, talk about whether or not Trump existing on Twitter is legitimate or not. This will be a core question in the debate. And in that, if you are the side that is saying that no, Donald Trump should not be on Twitter, you can make the argument that when he was on Twitter, his presence created an atmosphere of hostility to the point that if you were somebody of color, somebody of allegedly the wrong faith, then essentially your life on social media, which is pretty analogous to your day-to-day life, was essentially just horrifying. And because of the harm that millions of people were subject to because of Trump and his adversaries and his friends and whatnot, because of that, it's perfectly okay for us to censor him. That's like one way of dealing with it. But then somebody on the other end of the debate will simply say that no. How can you prove that Donald Trump saying something at X point in time caused something to some other person at X plus 10 point in time? You need to demonstrate that. And this is oftentimes the sort of the other end of the argumentation, which is that proving that causal link, that you saying something at a certain point in time genuinely led to someone doing something terrible, very soon after because of what you did, is often a very difficult thing to prove, number one. But number two, as the opposition, you can very easily just problematize the proposition's case by being like, what do you mean by significant and unavoidable? What is a significant harm? What is an unsignificant harm? And so on and so forth, right? But the point is, you could have a very good back and forth on this. The idea is simply to demonstrate that ownership and ownership and responsibility, this is something that will pop up in debates every now and then. So before we then actually now dive into how we can make principled arguments very quickly, are there any questions that anybody has? So I'm just going to look at my... So somebody has asked me a question. I won't obviously say who they are, but I think it's a good question that we all can engage with. the question is the following. Disregarding the fact that Trump is using Twitter, according to the principle, shouldn't he be blocked from all communication platforms? Okay, that's a good question. What do people think? Basically, what they're saying is that, if there is a reason for why he shouldn't exist on Twitter, there's a good reason for why he shouldn't exist on CNN or BBC or Instagram. What do you guys think? So I'll answer the question just in the interest of time. The answer to your question actually is it depends. Okay. Um, Personally, if I were to answer this question, I would say yes, which is that yes, the reasons for why you shouldn't exist on Twitter can potentially be extended to other communication platforms as well. But it depends on which context this is being asked. So, for instance, if this was asked as a point of information, and suppose that I said that, oh, no, 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 we would still keep him on the BBC and the CNN and traditional media outlets, then instantly I need to tell the judge why there's a distinction. This is really important, by the way. And you come across this in terms of principled arguments all the time. Making distinctions becomes really important. And this is one of those cases where you might have to make a distinction. However, you could just very easily say that, like, no, we think that he should be removed from other places as well. But then you have to be very careful as to how you like answer that question, because you could sound very unreasonable as well by just being like, oh, well, we want to block him from like literally the face of the earth. That would be a bit unreasonable. So you have to be a bit careful, but I think the answer to your question is probably yes. The ways that, however, it could be specific to Twitter if you can make like a very compelling case that he violated like speech clauses specific to Twitter and the other places not so much, which is why it's fine. So you could answer it that way. So there's a range of like answers, but I think in short, yes. Sorry, did somebody have a question? All right. Awesome. So I think let's take a 5-minute break, very quickly, and then we'll get into making principled arguments and how we can actually, make them. But just, if you have any questions in these 5 minutes, feel free to, ask me in the chat. I'll try to reply or maybe even answer them after the 5 minutes. And then, just take a few minutes to just sort of like, absorb the material that I've given you guys so far. If you have any lingering questions about, ownership or responsibility or anything of the sort, just ask me right now. You could even check in Stanford Encyclopedia, like literally in the next 5 minutes. But let's break for 5, and I will be back to explain to you how to make principled arguments. Okay, awesome. Okay, so we're gonna get back to now actually making principled arguments. Just to give you a short recap of what we've done so far, all we've done so far in the first half was we talked about what principled arguments are, just the basics. The second thing was then we talked about ownership, responsibility, and we talked about the harm principle. Three things. And the reason I picked these three topics was because I feel that, these are going to pop up every now and then in almost every debate, in every sort of like debate. I will say though that there are certain other topics which I would encourage that you have a look at as well. So from the top of my head, one of those topics will be something about the justice system and the principles of the justice system. So retribution, restitution, and rehabilitation. Again, have a look at these. This is also important, particularly for debates pertaining to criminal justice. For perhaps debates related to warfare or for debates related to conflict, have a look at the just war doctrine. Again, and just remember, by the way, all these sort of like readings or concepts are to act as frameworks for you. And you'll very quickly realize what I mean by that when we're going to discuss principled arguments. Before I do that, sorry, I have a question in the chat. Let me just have a look at this very quickly. So somebody in the chat asks, can't we argue that banning Trump on other platforms, especially on news outlets, would have an impact on political discourse, and therefore we shouldn't do that because it lessen public engagement with politics? Yes, that is a perfectly sound argument. It is a good argument. And if you're the side that's trying to say that Donald Trump shouldn't be banned from, most news platforms, that's a good argument to make. Yes. All right. So there are 5 steps that I think people can follow to make principled arguments. Step number 1 is asking yourself, can you? And this is really important. This is not to ask yourself that, can you make a principled argument? No. This is basically asking yourself, is it smart to make a principled argument in this debate? And the thing is, in every debate, you're going to be talking about ideas pertaining to fairness, justice, what's good, what's bad. That's going to happen in every debate. But not in every debate will you have the ability to make really clean, principled arguments. So, for instance, in a lot of actor debates that are set as this house as blah, 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 would do blah, blah, blah. It's often very challenging to make arguments in those contexts that are specifically principled arguments. So just remember, sometimes it makes complete sense. And if you think that you can make a solid principled claim and you can actually prove it, then you should make it, irrespective of whatever the motion is like, I think. But just give it a thought, okay? It's not necessarily important, nor is it the case that in every debate you will find a really good principled argument. And again, I think that this is something that you can learn through trial and error. I think you can also have a look at just debates on YouTube, and you'll have a good idea of what I mean by this. Because this is something you learn like with time and just like with practice. So that's number 1. The second step then, identify your concept. So this is really important, and this is what I was saying like a minute ago. All those things I just mentioned, like John Locke said this, and then this is a response to this framework, or the just war doctrine exists and it tells us how to behave in war, but there are XYZ issues with it. These are all points of reference to me in my head. At least that's how I think about them, right? So when I see a debate motion, and after I've sort of like decided that, I think I can make a principled argument here, my sort of intuition is to just be like, okay, what's the general sort of concept that I'm dealing with here? So let me give you an example for what I mean by this. I think in 2021, we had a debate, and the motion was, this house believes that all property that is basically vacant for 6 months should be taken away by the state. Okay. And I remember we were opposition. And as soon as I saw the debate motion, I just screamed like ownership. I just meant like ownership. Like there's no way the state can take away something like that. That's basically how I thought about it in prep, right? But the point is that once you have sort of decided and partially deciding whether you can or cannot make a principal argument and whether you should or should not make a principal argument for a specific debate motion, often works in tandem with you identifying the concept. If you can identify the concept really quickly, really precisely, and very cleanly, chances are you can make a good principled argument, right? So step 1 and 2 kind of work hand in hand, right? So think about the concept. Now over here, remember this. It's not just like, you see the motion and you just go like, I'm going to make an argument about ownership. You also need to know what the arguments for and against ownership generally work blind to debates. This is really important, right? Because you can approach this 2 ways. You could either like, sort of learn these frameworks, like from a debate sense. If you do it from that sense, I mean, it could work for you. It might work for most of you. But I would still say that it's worth like having a look at these concepts just like on their own and on their own merits and demerits, not from a debate lens, because then you'll treat the whole concept as like, how you're supposed to like sort of like engage with it. So just remember that like when you identify the concept, it's you need to know the ins and outs. This is why I keep saying that like principled arguments are often incredibly powerful, but only if they are made correctly, right? Sorry, not even correctly, if they're made properly. If they're not, they can be an incredibly like poor strategic like sort of, it can be a strategic mistake in a debate. All right, then. Step number 3, prove the existence of your principle. So when you think of the concept and by the way, sorry, one more thing. It can be a range of concepts. It's not important that it has to be one. It could be like 2, 3 different things, and you'll see that it's like the principle is operating like along those 3 different fronts. That's perfectly fine as well. You just want to keep it like narrow, and you want to keep it specific. All right, then. Step 3, prove the existence of your principle. What this basically means is when you have thought about your argument, when you've thought about the concept and you're going to be talking about ownership, for example, you need to, before you make your argument, you need to first demonstrate that this is a widely, existing principle. This is really important, right? Because a lot of times, principled arguments are made through the debater's intuition. But the thing about intuition is that it depends from person to person. And because it depends from, person to person, intuition can and cannot work sometimes. Because of that, it is very important that you first prove the existence of your principle. And what I mean by that is you basically tell the judge or the debate room that, look, this is something we already do in society. For instance, if this is a debate about speech acts and, banning or censoring speech, you could just say something along the lines of, in society, we already prevent individuals from exercising their positions in society and using their speech to incite violence or hostility towards individuals of vulnerable communities. We already do this in society and in the physical world. So what I've done right now is I've just basically told the judge that, hey man, look, we already do this, and this is a very common thing. When you say this, the strategic benefit of saying this is you basically convey to the judge what you're saying is something society already kind of does. And that just gives, I don't want to say authority to your argument, but it gives your argument this sort of benefit of familiarity. And that's always a good thing for a judge to see, right? So then you make a debate, then you prove the existence. And I think when you're proving existence of like, a principle, analogies are really, really useful. Does anybody know what an analogy is? Very quickly, if anybody can answer that, what an analogy is. Any thoughts? Yeah.
Comparing something like a concept to some other concept in order to better illustrate what it is.
Yeah, so basically, like, think of it this way. You're trying to draw parallels, right? That's what you're doing. So, analogies can be historical, as in they could be just genuine things that have happened. So for instance, in social movement debates, like, oftentimes debaters will say, oh, if we do X, then social movement will gain Y. And example is, what happened in XYZ year. In principled arguments, we can do something similar, which is basically we can say that, hey, look, we care about bodily autonomy so much in status quo. How do we know that? Where do we see that? Well, take the example of patients who have terminal illnesses. If the doctor offers them and guarantees them life-saving treatment, they can still say no. Because the obligation upon a doctor is not to save the life of a patient, it is to prevent additional suffering. And suffering is dictated by the patient's consent. And if the patient consents to, not get the treatment, then we don't give them treatment. This is an example of what I was trying to say. But the point is, analogies are incredibly useful in terms of establishing the familiarity of your principle and telling the judge that what you're about to say is pretty familiar, and you already kind of know what I'm about to talk about, but I'll still tell you what it is. That's the point of this. Step 4 then is make it debate specific. Thus far, you haven't actually made the argument. You've just told the judge that, like, this is what sort of the concept is. And by the way, you don't have to like tell the judge, by the way, that I'm going to make a utilitarian claim, or I'm going to make a this, that, blah, blah claim. You don't have to say that. This is just for your own reference. But then you have to make it more debate specific. And what that is like, if you have the concept down, if you know exactly what your principle is, like foundationally, what it talks about, then think of it as this. You have a principle, but there are certain fill in the blanks. And those fill in the blanks are certain debate or motion specific details that you need to put into that principle. So for instance, suppose you're the side in the, let's say the Donald Trump debate. Suppose you're the side that's saying that we should not remove him from Twitter, If you're that side, you're obviously the side that's making the claim about, censorship is bad and we shouldn't do it. You already have those arguments. You have the general claim. You want to tune that claim specific to the debate, right? And the way you do that is not very challenging. Here's an example. The harm principle, we covered it. What are the two metrics? The harm should be significant and unavoidable, right? Suppose you're using the harm principle in a debate. Either you're using it to, prove your own argument or to disprove the other side's argument. Doesn't matter, because you already know what the metrics are, right? Unavoidable and significant. What your job is to simply quantify it. And what I mean by that in simpler words is your job is just to explain that, right? And the way you explain that is by extracting some very specific details with respect to the motion. So for instance, if you're the Donald Trump debate and you're the side that's saying we don't want to do it, and you're saying the harm principle doesn't apply in this case. Okay, why doesn't the harm principle apply? Well, because we don't think his harm was significant enough. Why was his harm not significant enough? And then you can posit like various sorts of evidences that you think are sort of worthy enough are enough to prove that the harm wasn't significant. What you could also do is just be like, he's not responsible, like altogether. Like he just didn't cause any of this because you can't prove as proposition that his words actually led to XYZ outcome in a given time frame. There are a range of factors that can, influence what people say and do, but it is not okay to punish people in the middle for what the actions of, third parties are. So that's just, an example. So the point is and this is like perhaps like the most important step at the very end, but this step being done well depends on every other step before this having been done well. If you know the concept, if you have a specific idea of what the principle is, then it is simply a matter of filling in the blanks with what your metrics are. The only instance where this strategy might fail is if you don't know what the metrics are. And that will happen sometimes. But the thing is like when it comes to what sort of criteria, so for example, if you're the side that's, in a debate about whether someone or something should be banned. And suppose you just don't know what the harm principle is. Suppose you had no clue what the harm principle was, right? In those instances, then what you're supposed to do if you don't know what the metrics are is you're supposed to sort of like derive your own. Now, this might sound like a bit bit odd. Like, what do you mean, like derive your own? For instance, let me just give you a very simple example. Suppose you have a debate motion about, XYZ, Greta Thunberg should get the Nobel Prize. This house believes that Greta Thunberg should get the Nobel Prize, right? Now, this is a debate where, I mean, if you don't want to make a principal argument, you really don't need to. There's no particular need to. If you want to, you can. I, for one, did in this debate. But this was a debate where it was incredibly hard to come up with a principal argument because it was like, what do you give a Nobel Prize on the basis of? Like now I know, at that time I didn't know, right? So when it comes to cases like this, there's a little more groundwork that needs to be done. But remember, it always ties back to the first and second step. Can you make it? And do you know what your concepts are? Um, and if you can answer these two questions well, then everything later on will probably follow as okay. And then the fifth step is basically you tie it back. You tie it back to the debate motion. So you basically make the argument and then you just tie it back to the motion by being like, and therefore we have sort of like, proven this. I'll just give an example for what I mean by this and how I use this template. And I think we all can like collectively work to make one argument. There's also somebody who texted me saying that, can we argue against good principled arguments? I will try to do one, I promise. But at the moment, let me give you guys a debate motion. Let's take 3.5 minutes to make a principled argument using the sort of like steps I gave you. And don't worry, if it doesn't work out the first time, it's perfectly fine. It's just a matter of trial and error. So I'm going to put a debate motion and let's think about it. Okay, sorry, this is a little oddly phrased. Basically, this is I'm unaware of how many of you are like novices or not. So I didn't phrase the motion as it is. This is basically just a rephrasing of the motion. This house would legislate billionaires out of existence. I just phrased it like this. But basically, all it means is that if you earn more than 999 million of whatever currency or whatever it is, all the earnings above that go to the state. And the motion is basically that, this should happen. So if does anybody have any questions with respect to the motion? And we're doing proposition, by the way, if anybody's curious about that. So let's take 3 minutes. Let's take three to 3.5 minutes to make a principled and a normative claim for why the state should do this, right? So let's take a few minutes.
I have a question. Will these taxations on the money in which these people receive or on the assets that will push them over 1 billion in net worth?
Okay, so this is a very good question. Just for the purposes of this exercise, assume that it's their money and not their assets. But that is a very good question. And if this was an actual debate, you should most certainly ask that. Just for the purposes of this activity, let's suppose it's just their, it's hard money, like it's actual paper money. Cool. Okay. Let's take 3 minutes and then we'll reconvene. Let's take a few more seconds. Also, Janul, if you are still here, I believe we have 10 more minutes left.
Yeah, definitely. So if you want to wrap it up after this, let's just get a quick picture. And yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, no, I'll do that. I apologize. I was a bit slow for a lot of the content. So there's some things that I missed, but I'll very quickly flag them at the end. And of course, like I'll also put my like email address and anything in the link. So if you guys have any questions, you can reach out. But you can have a look at those things in your own time as well. Janul is also probably very good with this, so you could even ask him. Anyhow, any thoughts? Who has a principled argument? Also, I'm very sorry, we might not be able to like do the response to a good principled argument. But I can tell you, you can go watch WDC 2016 final, watch the Prime Minister's speech, and try to refute that principle. It'll be a fun exercise. You can have fun doing that. So yeah, any principled arguments for the motion that I gave? Anyone? It's also, by the way, completely fine, like whatever you have. It actually is like completely okay. My sort of like template for principled argument is it's not like I don't know if everybody has the same one. I think it's a bit different, so it's perfectly fine. Okay. Okay, so we have a couple of answers. I'm just gonna read them out. One person says state's authority to handle and balance economy. Then someone says, can we use utilitarianism here? Because according to that, the state will focus on what will happen. Okay, yeah, awesome. So I give this motion intentionally because I didn't cover one thing, which is really, really central to the idea of principled arguments. And I'm unfortunately can't also spend a lot of time on them. But it is utilitarianism. That is also a branch of philosophy and moral argumentation. What you need to remember, however, is this. First of all, what is utilitarianism? Utilitarianism is basically a very simple sort of philosophical outlook. It basically says that an act X is justified and permissible if X leads to net or overall happiness for most of society. So it's basically just a equation of happiness and unhappiness. And if a certain act can lead to more happiness than unhappiness, it's a good thing. And as per utilitarianism, it's okay to do. Obviously, there are several issues with utilitarianism. You could very easily talk about the tyranny of the majority and how it prioritizes numbers of people over actual vulnerabilities of people. But again, I'm sorry I can't talk a lot about this right now, but I would encourage people to have a look at it. Anyhow, back to the argument. So you all are kind of in the right space. I think there are a range of different arguments that can be made for why the state can do this. I think the first thing you can very easily talk about is, there's an impending homelessness crisis in the vast majority of countries across the world. And it's not just homelessness, it's, people not having access to welfare. It's a lot of, poor economic circumstances for a lot of people. Okay, who's responsible for this? Well, we're going to claim, because we're government, we're going to say the state is responsible. How is the state responsible? You can give a bunch of reasons. The state, having historical and poor budget allocations, or for instance, the marginalization of certain groups of people historically, et cetera, et cetera. So we have shown that, the state wronged these people. We've talked about that these people are in need. There's still one thing that we haven't really shown, which is probably the most important thing. Can anybody guess what that is? This is like one link that we need to show now. If we show it, we make the argument and we're done. Any idea? Out of just time, the link that we're missing is, what does this have to do with rich people, right? So it's, if you were to make the argument as is, it's true. Lots of people are going through poor economic things. Is the state responsible? Arguably, maybe you can win that. But what does that have to do with people, making more than $999 million or 999 million rupees or anything of the sort, right? What does that have to do with that? That's the link that's missing, right? And the way you basically just have to prove that, or the way you can like sort of, like bridge that, all you have to say is this: states, and this is by the way like how I sort of like conceptualize the argument. Does anybody over here know what antitrust laws are? Any idea what they are? You often must like hear in the news like, the US government is thinking of breaking apart Amazon or big companies. Basically, the argument that you can make over here is you can either say that rich people are directly responsible for the bad things that have happened to these people because they have the capacity, and the harm to them by taking away a portion of their wealth is very little compared to the benefit to the other person, which is much bigger, and they're more vulnerable people. So overall, you have more happiness. That's one way of proving it. It's a perfectly fine, principled way of doing it. The other way you could potentially do this is by basically saying that, look, in the economy and in general, we have this. Sorry, 1 second. Sorry about that. That's my cousin. So what I was saying is that, in society in general, there's a general principle that the state and as society we abide by, which is that we want to make sure that most people have a level playing field, or at least we can try to give as many people a level playing field. And what that basically means is we don't want people to have absolute advantages in most things they do. So for instance, a company could be huge, and a company could be basically outcompeting everybody else in the market. They could be great for consumers and they could be great for the economy as well. But chances are the state could still break them apart, and they will break them apart. States have broken apart big companies in the past as well. Now, this isn't the same as an individual, but the idea is about making that link, which is that when certain players get too big, or when certain players get too important, states can, and states often do, to bring back society to that sort of like level playing field. States can take away certain things from them, right? So that's another way of approaching it. But the point, I think, is like to demonstrate is that there are like two different ways you could have made this argument. You could have made that argument like I showed, which is you could have just basically said taking away a little bit of money from like somebody who's pretty well off is very little of a harm, as compared to somebody else who doesn't have access to a lot of money as it is. Or you could do what I talked about. The other argument I gave is a much more bolder claim. It requires a little more work because it's dealing with a much more abstract idea. But either argument, is solid. Either argument can work, and either argument is good. There are several things that I unfortunately could not cover in the interest of time, but I would just say that everything that I said, you should definitely go to Stanford Encyclopedia for Philosophy and have a look at everything that we talked about over there. You should have a look at, WDC 2016, the PM speech and the principle and how that was made. That was pretty good. John and I have often talked about it, and I think it's a great principle, so you should have a look at it. And the last thing that I missed, which is also really super important, is weighing. A lot of like problems that people often have with principled arguments is that they often don't know how to weigh them with consequentialist or practical claims. But I think that's a little like that requires like an hour or two on its own, given that sort of like the techniques that go into it are a bit more challenging. But I would say as is, I think like if you guys practice enough with the same template, you should be able to come up with like some fun normative arguments. And I will put in my email as well if anybody wants to get in touch, has a lingering question, I don't know, just wants to ask anything. But yeah.
Thank you so much, Sheheyar, from the entire circuit. I think I speak for everyone here and from the Debaters Council as well. Last thing before we wrap up, could anyone who feels comfortable to do so just turn your camera on, so we could snap a quick picture of this for like future programming, and also we'll see you again next week for another session. So if you could get your camera on just for like one quick picture, that would be really, really great. Would really, really love that.
Sorry, John, this might be an odd question. Am I required for this picture as well?
Would be preferred.
Okay. Okay.
Unless you have a marked objection to
I mean,
all right.
no, it's fine.
To be fair, you're being recorded as well.
Yeah, I was about to say that. I was like, there's no point. So
All right. Yeah, lovely. Thank you so much, Shreya. Thanks, guys, and have a good night.